people don't want to get rid of representative democracy. What they want is representative democracy that works better.
Misinformation is a serious threat to democracy today. It's a serious threat to representation.
Hello and welcome to Democratic Innovations, the podcast series where we explore how democratic innovations are reshaping the landscape of citizen participation in response to the ongoing crisis of representative democracy. I am Roberto Falanga, researcher at the University of Lisbon, and I'll be your host. In this first episode, we're focusing on an issue that is often taken for granted, which is democratic innovations improve democracy. But is that true? To help us navigate this topic, we have invited Professor Mark Warren and Professor Thamy Pogrebinschi. Mark Warren is professor at the Department of Political Science, University of British Columbia, and directs the project Participedia, the most known platform that collects data about democratic innovations around the world. Thamy Pogrebinschi is a senior researcher at the WZB Berlin Social Science Center. Since 2015, she has coordinated the most comprehensive database on democratic innovations in Latin America called Latino. Together with them, we will dive into democracy deficits, social polarization, and the engineering of democratic innovations as possible context-based solutions. We will also interrogate the role of digital tools and social movements for the future of democratic innovations. There are no easy answers, and there is no one-fits-all solution. So, let's start. It seems that there is an agreement on the role of innovations as instrument to ameliorate democracy rather than being an end itself. I'd like to ask you what the alleged improvement of democracies is or should be made of. What evidence do we have today of improvement, and what is still missing to further improve democracy in the future? Mark, would you like to start?
I'm happy to start. Let me just follow up on your comments, Roberto. I tend to look at democratic innovations as things that can improve existing representative democracy rather than as standalone forms of democracy. And if we think in these terms, then we need to think about the deficits in existing representative democratic systems. I've mostly focused on deficits in North America and Europe. When you look at these countries, you find that there are growing legitimacy problems, public perceptions of elites as controlling the political system, low levels of responsiveness, flatlining participation in voting, although plenty of participation in things like protests, polarizing populations, especially on the right, which is then being mobilized by right-wing populists, often authoritarian populists, as we see with Trump in the US or Polyev in Canada. And of course, there are many, many examples in Europe. And Thamy will no doubt address Bolsonarismo, if I said that properly. But at the same time, democratic values in these countries are not weakening. There hasn't been an upsurge of anti-democratic sentiment. The right-wing populisms that we see are mobilizing discontents that were already there. But generation by generation, people are becoming more democratic. And so I think what we have is a performance gap. People want more out of their democracies. Representative systems are not giving them more. And so I've tended to think about democratic innovations as plugins, right? Where are the deficits? How might these deficits be addressed by democratic innovations?
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, Thamy. So where are the deficits?
Yeah, well, but first of all, it's a pleasure to be here with Mark, who's someone who has a big influence in the way I think, and that's why there should be very little disagreement. Also, I mean, I would begin by repeating what he said. I totally agree, and actually, my way of looking at democratic innovations through a more problem-oriented perspective is also very much influenced by Mark's way of seeing it. And I think that's precisely the starting point. I would just go in the same direction. I think we've been thinking on the field of improvement of democracy and democratic innovations as, okay, we need to do different than represented democracy, or something new, or to innovate. What is innovate is just to do something different, alternative, more radical. And sometimes we forget the basic, which is if democratic innovations are to improve something, what is to be improved? And this answer is obviously context-based. It won't be the same in all places, in all countries, and in all times. And I think this is also one problem that we have been facing. For example, the field of democratic innovation, both in theory and on empirical study, pretty much began or gained strength with the participatory budgeting in the early 90s that began in Brazil. And this is where, looking to what was happening, so much work was produced, and also so much conceptualization and everything. And then afterwards, there was a period of enormous frustration when empirically the participatory budgeting couldn't be reproduced in the North, in Europe, and in other places the way it was. And then, the aim of social justice was not implemented. So there is no real improvement. That is then, it is that useless. We can't get citizens to participate if we cannot really accomplish that aim of a social justice. But, well, maybe it worked in a place like Brazil because we had a context of a high inequality. And then you could really see improvements because they were really, it was very clear what improvements there were should be made. And the whole design was done to achieve that. And when I implement something like participatory budgeting somewhere, I definitely had to look at that context and see what is to be improved. Maybe you'll find another context. And then it doesn't mean that the design doesn't work. And then we're seeing the same thing now with the citizens' assembly somehow. It began somehow to work just like the PBE was previously, like the only one democratic innovation in town, such as, of course it is not, but it's like this is to recite, not to innovate. And there is this attempt to implement it that everywhere, following one same design. Well, maybe this is not appropriate. So why are we implementing democratic innovations? Which designs work better for what? And to know that, we need to know which are the problems we want to address. Because, of course, there are some universal problems to democracy everywhere. If we assume democracy to be universal as a value, but implemented context-based, when it is implemented, of course, there are some problems that you will see some deficits, that they're basically there. Maybe if we assume democracy as representative democracy, they should be pretty much the same. So identifying these problems first, and then deciding which democratic innovations are to be taken in place and how, and which designs, and it's very important. So I think it's this kind of thinking that we may have do an effort to do more seriously, I guess, instead of just thinking on replicating, reproducing designs and implementing as much citizen assembly, for example, as we can, as it was a solution for climate problems and urban problems at the same time. We should just identify the problems where and when we want to address the problem, and not simply put more citizens to participate, because this is also not the solution for anything.
If I got correctly, I mean, there is no one size fits all solution, right? And so if we do not know the problems and the context, I mean, there is no democratic innovation that can really improve democracy. And I was thinking about the many toolkits now circulating internationally, and I was wondering whether the problem is when we approach innovations as tools. So maybe democratic innovations are much more than tools. So I'm wondering if we really need toolkits for innovating democracy.
I think I would say about that I think all of the toolkits are fine because if you follow a problem and you find that a democratic innovation is the right kind for that problem, maybe there are problems of representativeness or problems of thinking through, what publics will want, deliberativeness. Once you get to that stage, then there are better and worse ways of organizing democratic innovation. So, for example, with deliberative mini publics or citizen assemblies, there are now lots of toolkits and there are lots of organizations that specialize in these. And what they do is very good. They have professional facilitators, very intricate ways of doing stratified random sampling of a population, very good at developing the remit and so on. But that's pretty far down the pipeline, right? So that's after a problem has been defined and a process identified. Now, one of the problems we face now is that there are a lot of democracy entrepreneurs that have a particular way of doing things. And so they will tend to try to sell what they do as the solution to everything. So we need to step back from that while still valuing the intricate knowledge that is and skills that are necessary to make these things work. I want to underscore this. A badly done new democratic process will tend to delegitimize that process. And so we really need people with these, with good skills.
I agree. I think it has been thinking having a minimal toolkit or whatever also depends on what you're doing with that and where. And then, of course, there is a minimum and there could be. But I guess when you began your question by saying, okay, the way both of you sees then democratic innovation is a tool somehow. I mean, it's a function, it's a tool. But what then is a tool in the sense, like, democratic innovations, they can be institutions, they can be mechanisms, they can be processes. Mark put the questions whether there are democratic innovations without citizens too. Maybe still we have democratic innovations. And so can we have also democratic innovations without institutions, processes, or mechanisms? I guess so. So for example, something that I'm personally very much interested at the moment is the idea of collective intelligence, which is something, it's an old idea, as all ideas are, but you had like John Dewey talking about that. So the thing is, you don't have to shoot with mechanisms or processes or any design. You have a citizens, but sometimes not necessarily, and a unidentifiable maybe group, which is not a group of people, but who can simply participate and take part in something and provide solutions to problems and crowdsource information and crowd map also the location of problems and then ways of addressing it, and using digital tools. When we talk about tools, democratic innovation is tools. I think definitely we need to investigate more seriously the potential of digital democratic innovation. So I think the idea of a tools here is maybe more of a something leading to something else. And I think the minimal agreement here is that the something else is an improvement of democracy, or some problem, or addressing some problem that can make democracy work better.
I understand that. I mean, we have tools, but actually the tools are not the problem. I mean, the problem is maybe some entrepreneurial fashion through which we promote democratic innovations, and I found it interesting to think about the something else that democratic innovations can provide. I'm trying now to think about this something else, and I wanted to ask you. If you see some specific idea or ideal of representative democracy, or whether is it rather an improvement of some specific mechanism of governance. What I mean is, whether when we think about the improvement, do we think it as either more theoretical or empirical, or whether is it both? How can we make sense of this combination, if any?
Well, if we work this through for the side of citizens, there's some new work in Germany that suggests that at least in most European countries, and I expect in the US, Canada, Australia, and so on too, people don't want to get rid of representative democracy. what they want is representative democracy that works better. They want a kind of more responsive system. Now, the problem from the standpoint of democratic innovations is that our systems are very complex with many institutions and points of entry and thousands of ways of improving responsiveness. So it's at that level that we're not going to have easy answers, right? We need to think about the responsiveness of Congress or the responsiveness of this bureaucracy or that school board and so on. And this work out of Germany is also suggesting that people would like maybe more hybrid or blended forms of government and governance. So it would be, Congress putting together a citizens' assembly to look at issue X or issue Y. Mm-hmm. There is other research shows that people are willing to say look at if it's a citizen assembly or deliberative mini public, if they know about that, to treat it as a trusted information proxy, so they don't necessarily need to be participating more or even deliberating more, but they need trust in these processes. One of the, again, an interesting finding from the democratic innovation literature is that people tend to like citizens who are representing other citizens. They are generally cynical about politicians, tend to, on average, see them as corrupt and unresponsive. But bodies made up of kind of regular citizens, people tend to like that, especially if they've kind of done their due diligence on an issue. I think the one thing that we haven't been doing a very good job about is thinking about how democratic innovations might address large-scale structural problems. Market-driven or capitalist-driven inequality, for example, or foreign policy, or offshoring of jobs, or these sorts of things. And here I want to come back just for a second to Thamy's mention of digital tools. We're all doom and gloom now about AI and social media and so on and so forth. But we may want to come back to some of the optimism of 15 years ago about digital tools, because we can also use these to scale processes. We're just at the very beginnings of thinking this through. But some of these tools might enable us to scale things that, for the most part, have been conducted locally and at a small scale.
Yes, I mean, honestly, I think we should start thinking on the tools, like the digital tools. I mean, as a basic start, should we think everything else? Because your question began with the representative democracy, empirical, theoretical problems. So supposedly democratic innovations, they are there, or we began talking about them, assuming that representative democracy had problems, and then there is participatory democracy as a possible solution, and deliberative democracy, and everything as a solution to improve the problems of representative democracy. And this is where democratic innovations come from. But the thing is, representative democracy itself was also created and invented
as a solution
in a way, and mass parties themselves also as an innovation that people were scared about at the time, even. But in a moment in which we had very different circumstances and conditions that we have today. So representative democracy was invented in a time in which communications was much more limited and geographical distance much larger and problematical and so on. And then that was necessary to have people representing other people, because, well, supposedly, not all people could be involved in decisions. They might still not be in a practical way. But still, today we have the digital tools. And of course, there are people, as Mark also mentioned, talking about that and writing about how you can use digital tools to improve representative democracy already for a long time, even before imagining things that we now have. But still, how much use we are doing of that? Seriously.
Yeah.
In some countries or in some cities, there are some experiments, some attempts. Maybe we could I think we could start even smaller, so to say, instead of thinking, well, that every citizen could, from his her computer at home, take part into decisions and be deciding and then telling legislators what they should do. I mean, we could also start thinking, what are the concrete problems of representative democracy today? Because I mean, the representative democracy is what we have, and we won't have, at least in our lifetime, be able to substitute that for anything else. So how can we improve it instead of trying to think on alternatives or substitution? Some countries are suffering a lot with polarization. Some countries are suffering still a lot with authoritarianism. Some countries are still suffering a lot with misinformation. Misinformation is a serious threat to democracy today. It's a serious threat to representation. I mean, it's maybe one of the major ones, I would say, in the sense of if you want the idea of representation to work as it should, and then misinformation can simply make that impossible, in the sense of citizens really being um, voting for who or what they believe they should. They simply don't know. So this is a big threat that I think we should take more serious, and also in our field of democratic innovations and how democratic innovations can fight misinformation, for example. How can we make electoral processes more clear and transparent and fair? How can we make political institutions more responsive? How can we make policies more congruent with citizens' interests and needs? So how can we use these two tools more democratically to safeguard democracy against misinformation, against political falsehoods, which are instantaneously propagated, making an electoral process, for example, impossible. I mean, completely non-transparent and non-fair and everything. So, yes.
Yeah. I mean, I was wondering whether we have been very good at producing solutions, but maybe less good at understanding the problems. If you agree, I mean, I want to go back to one sentence that you said, Mark, which is people don't want to get rid of representative democracy. They want it more responsive. And actually, it is something that Thamy has also stressed now. And I was wondering whether democratic innovations can improve representative democracy only, or is I mean, if there is room for the improvement of other approaches to democracy. What I mean is, if you think that democratic innovations can improve also participatory and deliberative democracy, I mean, whether there is an internal process of learning from democratic innovations. If we want to kind of go beyond the idea of solving the malaise, solving the deficits of representative democracy only, then maybe we are also learning something through these innovations within other approaches to democracy.
Well, let me start with the question of whether democratic innovations can improve representative democracy maybe more directly. So we are in danger in the field of thinking about setting representative democracy to one side and thinking about democratic innovations as a separate category of kind of supplements or something like that. But representative democracy isn't finished improving, if we can put it that way. In the U.S., of course, there's tactics of voting suppression and access to voting, those sorts of things. There are interesting experiments with connecting representatives more deliberatively to their constituents. There are, of course, still old electoral reform problems. Again, I think many of the northern European countries more or less have this right, but the U.S. still has a very clunky, unrepresentative system. So we don't want to lose sight of, again, depending on the system, improvements that need to be made to older forms of representative democracy. We do have a problem to go on to a slightly different topic of elected representatives, especially not knowing very much about democratic innovations, or when they know about them, seeing them as a threat to their own legitimacy. And so we haven't, for the most part, seen a lot of take up at the kind of elected political elite level. There are some interesting exceptions. The Irish Citizens' Assemblies mixed in politicians. The organizers of the Citizens' Assemblies believed that if politicians could see what citizens can do, they would be much less cynical about citizen capabilities. They would see that there are other things besides referendums or town halls where angry people show up and yell at them. So I think there's some interesting promise there. And it may be that the learning from democratic innovations might be most important at this kind of elite level. I would say that elites in bureaucracies and agencies have ironically tended to be much more friendly to democratic innovations. And it's probably because they have very direct legitimacy problems. They're not getting the legitimacy that they need from elected representatives. And every policy that they produces a constituency. They then need to develop legitimacy with that constituency. And so we've seen quite a bit of innovation there. So even within the kind of complex ecologies that make up democratic systems, we see quite a bit of variation as to where democratic innovations might have an impact and the kinds of problems of plugging democratic innovations into already existing systems.
Thank you, Mark. Thamy.
Let me begin by noting something very interesting in your question, because you asked us if democratic innovations they can improve participatory and deliberative democracy.
Yeah.
In participatory and deliberative democracy, they're not an empirical reality per se. We're always trying to make the theory fit the reality. I mean, trying to conceive designs and implement processes, and so that could fit that theory. Deliberative democracy is a lot about that. The mini publics is about that. So it's how can you then have a certain design in which you can have those ideal conditions for deliberation, in which then you will have a result, a decision which would be based on that principles that can assure like a real deliberation take place. So you're trying to come up with a design to fit the theory. But it's interesting to think the other way around. Why can't we really take seriously the idea of theorizing and conceptualizing based on the reality that we have, on the empirical things that we have, as more sort of a materialism which is normative at the same time. We're always trying to use normative theories to design reality, to say things should be like that, so let's try to be that way. Yes, but how can we then rethink concepts based on how things are really happening? We maybe look at how people are solving their problems through voicing, through talking to one another, exchanging arguments, and then try to think that as a starting point, also to think on innovations and on new designs to do theory about that. How people really using digital tools like hacking. Let's take that seriously. Microtasking, which is something which is fascinating. I mean, there's a lot of important issues that have been done with digital tools, with microtasking. I mean, a lot of people doing different things. Collective intelligence, how the way people are really doing things or talking to each other or participating. So that's why it's also important to look beyond and in other places, in Global South, I would say, of course, in Latin America. And there is not only a broad range of designs, of processes, mechanisms, institutions, but also of ways people are simply doing those things, participating or believing that they are deliberating. And in fact, solving problems, addressing their common concerns and then issues and coming up with solutions and then improving their society, their life, their communities, and in a larger scale than democracy. And then from that on, we can rethink the concept, like citizen participation itself. See, I mean, we have practical problems, so let's have practical solutions. And then I could say more specifically something about deliberative democracy if we have time, in the sense this is a concern I have today, in the sense of we've been thinking a lot on citizens assembly, still a lot on deliberation. I think definitely we need to move beyond that. When you ask can democratic innovations improve theory, I would say, well, how can we improve the idea of it's not a matter of just improving citizen assembly, but thinking on other deliberative designs beyond the citizen assemblies instead of just trying to replicate it anywhere as a solution for everything. This would be one thing. So how can we still have, for example, social struggles and social movements being included? How can you have like an open participation? I want to participate in citizens' assemblies too. So, I mean, it is great that we have something that is really representative and can really ensure deliberation. But how participatory is that, in fact?
While you were speaking, Thamy, I was thinking maybe we should be brave enough to say that participatory and deliberative democracy have deficits too. I mean, if we really want to improve those other approaches to democracy, instead of somehow taking for granted that participatory and deliberative democracy work and work well, to face the deficits of representative democracy. And then, yeah, I agree. I mean, to make also the maybe to look at these theories from the empirical evidence that we have today about the way these practices work, and somehow also um, expanding the scope of those practices. I mean, the way we understand those practices, instead of focusing only on the citizens' assemblies or whatever format we think is the most successful at the moment, and rather embrace also the other more informal practices of participation and the way citizens want to get involved and have a say in democracy. So, on that, I have a question which is about how radical are democratic innovations, in the sense, I mean, one of the most noticeable deficits of democracy is the exclusion of underrepresented groups, right? And I mean, both participatory and deliberative democracies aim to trigger inclusion through different formats of participation. Um, However, and this is something that Mark touched upon, we sometimes leave somehow untouched the powerful elites through these democratic innovations. And I was wondering whether this focus on the improvement can somehow leave aside the more radical goals of democratic innovations in breaking through the powerful elites.
Well, let me try to talk about this. I've moved a little bit away from the language of radicalism
Mhm.
because it's often associated with the language of revolution or dramatic system change. And I think that almost every functioning, actually existing democracy today is so complex that it's almost impossible to think about radical change. I think that just because of the way these societies operate, we need to think about, well, reform is kind of an insipid word, but pressures, nudges, and so on and so forth to make them work better. This is just kind of a sociological complexity argument that it's hard to imagine turning the system upside down in any radical way. But we can use all of the tools that are embedded in democracies to push for quasi-radical reforms, if we can put it that way. We've got freedom of assembly, free speech, free organization, huge numbers of resources. I do think, now to come back around to how radical democratic innovations are, I think that many democratic innovations are not very radical at all, and sometimes even anti-democratic. And so it's a misnomer to call them democratic innovations. And what I'm thinking here are about processes that we've started to call kind of democracy washing processes, by analogy to greenwashing processes. It can often be the case that when elites get into trouble, bureaucratic elites or elected elites, they will reach for something that looks like a democratic innovation, but they will try to control the agenda. They will try to use it to affirm a decision they've already made that's not very popular. Now, how do you avoid this? Well, I think that the democratic innovations that are more likely to be interesting and radical and push things along are coupled with social movements and organization, kind of in the environment of the democratic innovation. There was actually an old study in Brazil, I believe it was in Rio, by Vera van Schaden, who looked at how, I'm now on Thamy's territory here, so I'm doing this with caution. It looked at the penetration of Brazil's universal healthcare system. And what she found was that the healthcare councils that had been set up in neighborhoods to implement the system worked when there were healthcare advocates organized in a social movement-like ways in the neighborhoods. And where there weren't those advocates, these councils, which one could say were kind of grassroots-focused innovations, didn't work, didn't do much to improve healthcare. So one of the things that we haven't done a good job of in the research field is to think about how democratic innovations pair with things like social movements, which I think is quite essential to the democratic part of the democratic innovations.
I agree. Thamy.
Yeah, I totally agree with Mark, and of course I'm happy with the example he brought about, and we can think of others too. And one thing that crossed my mind as Mark was mentioning the health councils in Brazil is, for example, in Venezuela is a case. I mean, in which it became like almost forbidden to talk about democratic innovation in Venezuela because of the whole context of authoritarianism and everything, and how much evidence it was found of clientelism, of a non-democratic democratic innovations. But still, there were some forms of a people doing things for people in the communitarian councils they had, that they were like thousands sometimes in some cities, and they was pretty much oriented to problems. I mean, to local problems, and people addressing those problems. They had resources from the state for that. All the problems that were found, I mean, in the sense of they being partisan and clientelistic and everything, this is true. But then we threw away the baby with the bathwater and stopped looking at that as something that could be interesting. And what we had that is precisely also that, the social movements being part of it, as the citizens doing for themselves and deciding what were the problems, and not having then the elites who are those who implement democratic innovations in many cases, and definitely it's how it is here in Europe. Somehow, I mean, the political elites, you have the legislatures, you have and administrations implementing it, and not thinking on democratic innovations as being something that is done by the citizens, organized by the citizens, or by social movements too. I mean, in the theory, in the field of democratic innovation, we're starting to look a little bit more. There are a lot of very interesting work and research being done now in this direction, which is wonderful. But I think this is a little bit also of the point. If we want to see how then innovations they can disrupt the system, or somehow don't live untouched, as you put it, the powerful elites, then maybe we have to confer more resources or space of validity, or studying to begin with more certain forms of organization, of action, of processes that are being putting forward in certain places, and by the people themselves, and also by social movements also to, and how to bring that together. I mean, how to think also democratic innovations as something that would involve in its implementation the state, the government, but also directly civil society. Also, why not the private stakeholders and the citizens, and why not also international organizations, where they can help with the money in certain countries in which there is this need of a money, of resources to implement new democratic design. Well, it's interesting to look to how certain groups who are not being represented have been trying to make themselves more visible and more also represented, and then try to replicate that in a larger way, so to say. I would say here there are, if you look to Latin America, for example, very interesting ways in which, like, women or Black people or indigenous people, they're trying to find a voice, trying to make themselves visible, trying to enter the political process sometimes, and digital tools have been very helpful for that.
Thank you all for joining us, and thanks so much Mark Warren and Thamy Pogrebinschi for being our guests. This podcast is sponsored by the EU-funded project INCITE-DEM, the Institute of Social Sciences of the University of Lisbon, the Center for Ecology, Evolution and Environmental Changes, and the Competence Center on Participatory and Deliberative Democracy of the European Commission. In the next episode, we'll be delving into the topic of citizen trust through democratic innovations. Guiding us through this discussion will be Brigitte Geisel and Francesco Veri. So, stay tuned. This episode was produced by me, Roberto Falanga, with the collaboration of Eleonora Tulumello, who also handled live sound engineer, editing, and post-production. You can follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter at INCITE-DEM, Citizens Reinventing Democracy, for updates and additional content. All the episodes will be available on Spotify and your favorite podcast platforms. Find us on YouTube too.